webinars that we've been doing focusing on giving and generosity. So today we are looking at storytelling as a way of encouraging generosity. And the way these webinars have been planned is that we've been talking about recovering from lockdown in the first one, and we've been looking at ways then in which you can increase your digital giving. Hopefully you have found those useful and the resources that are online, and we are, as always, very, very grateful for the Church of England Parish Resources team, Parish Buy-in team, for sharing their knowledge with us, which has been incredibly helpful for us. Today we have another guest, so if you're looking at the screen, you're probably wondering, we've got a special guest, which is Jonathan de Bernhard Wood, who is National Giving Advisor at the Church of England. So many thanks, Jonathan, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you very much. And also on the panel, we have Mark Brampton, as you all know, is our Parish Resource Advisor, Jan Boyce from the finance team, and Gareth also from the finance team. Hi everyone, thank you for coming along. So the panel are here to answer any questions that you have, but first I'm going to hand over to Mark for a quick introduction. And thank you very much, Mark.
Okay, yeah, well, a big thank you to Jonathan for coming to join us this week. Jonathan's done some remarkable work immediately with the Church of England. Some of you know we had a wonderful leader of the stewardship in Church of England before, and brought the whole church to a certain place. And Jonathan has picked that up and absolutely moved it forward in a really wonderful way with strategy. So we're really impressed with seeing that. I know Bishop Andy's seen Jonathan's presentation. We were all really pleased. Jonathan's probably travelled more before lockdown. This is almost like a respite for you, isn't it, lockdown? Because Jonathan, I think, has travelled almost every motorway and parish in England, I think now, and even, as I say, coming to join us in Wales to talk to Bishop Andy, stewardship lead. So do thank you for all the work you've done. And Jonathan's working hard to strengthen the Church of England. And as we've always said, with stewardship, it's a wonderful line of work to be in, because all the stewardship advisors are so generous with each other, and Jonathan's demonstrating that generosity to us in giving this time. So Jonathan, just really want to hand over to you, and thank you for coming to talk to us about the whole message of generosity and telling the story, really, the storytelling. So I'll pass over to you now if you want to share your screen with us. That's fine. I'm going to mute myself now while you're talking. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Mark. Thank you, and hello, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. When Mark mentioned about webinars, I thought fabulous idea, but storytelling particularly really excited me, because I think it's such a critical part of fostering and encouraging generosity. So it is great to be part of this session, and certainly hope that what I say is useful, and it would be really good to get your feedback and your thoughts on the importance of storytelling in terms of generosity. I actually wanted to start with a story. I thought that would kind of make sense in terms of the nature of what we're about, because I think I should say that before I worked in this role, and Mark is right, I think I visited 90% of Church of England dioceses before lockdown, which was in just over a year, that was a lot of miles. And the job has changed quite a lot since then, of course, in the last 6 months of lockdown. But it's been fantastic to get out and about and to see the opportunities and the challenges that dioceses faced. But one of the questions I would always ask is about stories. Is tell me your generosity story. What's the story that's most inspired you or encouraged you in terms of your ministry? And I was thinking back before this role. So I'd worked for various charities really since I left college, and how much of my work was telling stories. And I think particularly for us in churches, we can, when we're talking about giving, we very often talk about finance and we talk about numbers. And I've got nothing against finance and nothing against numbers, but they're not great motivators. And very often, actually, when we talk about finance, we talk about it the wrong way round. Because what we talk about it in terms of, we need X £1,000 to go and pay our parish share, or to pay our insurance bill, or to pay whatever it is that's just loomed up. And if you're a giver, very often I think your reaction to that is, well, I haven't got X £1,000, so there's no point me contributing, and what I give is not going to go and make a difference. And so actually we can end up trying to encourage people but we end up demotivating them. And actually what people are giving is, they're giving because the change that we can achieve through what we go and give, through the call that God is making to us in terms of our ministry and the growth of our ministry of our churches, and how lives will be transformed as a result. And that stories are a key part of enabling that to happen, and they resonate in a way which enables people to motivate them, to inspire them, and to connect with them in a different way. And part of the reason behind that, I think, is because stories are about people. And it's when we talk about numbers, very often we can talk about buildings or institutions or cost centers or whatever. Stories always come back to people, and that's what to me makes them so special. They are they enable people to connect, if you like, and there's something in our brains which connects, which I think is just a wonderful thing. So, story I wanted to read, I wrote a book years ago in terms of giving and charities, and I talked about the story of Larry Walters. And so I just wanted to read this story from the book, because I think it's just a perfect example of how a story can take you somewhere which otherwise you wouldn't get. So, Larry Walters, American, he always wanted to fly. He used to sit in his garden chair in the backyard of his Los Angeles home and watch the planes fly overhead on their way to the airport. He was neither rich nor bright enough to become an airline pilot, but why should that stop him? He got together a parachute, a CB radio, a six-pack of beer, some peanut butter sandwiches, a ball-bearing gun, a flashlight, extra batteries, and an altimeter. The final pieces of the flying jigsaw were 45 helium-filled weather balloons. His preferred method of transport was his garden chair, so he tied the balloons to them. And what he envisaged would happen is that he would take the chair up a few hundred feet so that he could look down over his neighborhood, he could eat a few sandwiches, he could drink a few beers, and then when he was bored, he would pop a few of the balloons with a ball-bearing gun and gradually ease his way back down to earth. The reality was that when he untethered the garden chair, he rose at 1,000 feet a minute and eventually settled at 16,000 feet. We know it was 16,000 feet because he was at the same height as the airplanes circling the airport before landing. He ascended so fast that his glasses fell off, which was bad news, and he dropped the ball-bearing gun, which was very bad news. He drifted for an age before crashing into power lines, blacking out a neighborhood, but he miraculously survived. In my mind, this makes him a hero. Superb planning, creativity, determination, ingenuity, bravery, success, and boy did he know how to make a media story. With the benefit of hindsight, he was perhaps a bit over the top with the number of balloons, but that apart, he did a sparkling job. Now sadly, others did not agree, and he was fined $1,500 for, and I quote, operating a civil aircraft for which there is not currently in effect an airworthiness certificate, and for being in airport space and not contacting the control tower. A local bureaucrat rather marvellously said, "We know he broke some part of the Federal Aviation Act, and as soon as we decide which part it is, some type of charge will be filed. If you had a pilot's license, we'd suspend that, but he doesn't." When asked why he had did it, he said, "It was something I had to do. I had this dream for 20 years, and if I hadn't done it, I would have ended up in the funny farm." I love that story. I love that story because when we can talk about inspiration or creativity or determination, or we can use these words, but it's only when we hear them in stories that they change us, I think, and that they resonate. and that people remember them from time immemorial. When years and years and years ago, I worked for a charity which did lots of great things, actually, lots of really great things. And one of them was they run a women's refuge in London. And bearing in mind, this is 25 years ago now. And I remember speaking to one of the women in the refuge. And she described how on the day of her wedding, her husband had hit her and that she'd thrown the wedding ring in the fire. And I can still remember that story now. It resonated. I remembered it. It connected me in a way that I could have gone and spent all time talking about annual reports of this charity and the different activities it does and the different services it does. But it was the stories that I remembered. I worked for a charity which worked with deaf children, and one of the children, we ran a school, and he was an enormous guy, huge fella, and he talked about how why did he want to come to our school? It's because he talked about being bullied at his own school and how he brought along a football and no one would give him his football back. And it was just, these are the stories which just kind of illustrate and captivate and enable us to remember, I think, in really profound and powerful ways. And so it's those generous stories which I think are really important, because they just resonate with people and they enable people to remember. So we're moving from a kind of conceptual understanding, if you like, to something which talks about an individual's experience, and it's that which really resonates. When we do retreats on generosity and on giving, and one of the, half day, one day, an exploration of God's generosity. And the first question we go and ask anybody who's there is, what's your first experience of money? Now, I'm just going to give you a moment. Have a think. What is your first ever experience of money? What would that be? Doesn't have to be in a church. Not at all. But what would it be? I'll give you 20 seconds to go and think about that. Thank you, Maggie. Pocket money as a kid. Now, my experience, well, I had two experiences of money. The first, Fisher-Price shop till. Oh, thank you for that. That's fantastic. My first experience was, I used to go and see my great aunts who lived in Dewsbury in West Yorkshire. And every time we go, they would give me 10p. Me and my brothers, I had 3 other brothers, and we would all be given 10p when we heard the ice cream van, so we could go out and get an ice cream. And this used to happen for years and years, and then, but over time, of course, 10p wouldn't buy you an ice cream anymore. So my parents used to surreptitiously bump up that 10p as we were on our way out, so we didn't have the kind of embarrassment of asking our great aunts for more money. But what did I learn? I learned that the value, the price of things changes over time. That was my story. So that was, but I'm not very good at remembering, so I can't remember whether that was my first experience or this other story. Anyway, the other story was, I'll come to it in a minute. So I was deliberating whether to go and say that another one. And then the person next to me went and gave his story. And his story was, I remember, I grew up in Yorkshire. And my first memory of money is losing £10. Losing a £10 note. And that's what he really remembered. And this gave me a real dilemma, because the other story I had, which I couldn't remember which one came first, was I grew up in Yorkshire and I distinctly remember finding a £10 note. I suddenly had this kind of awkward feeling that I might owe this person £10, because anyway, my story was I found this £10, and back in those days, and I think people still do it a bit actually, we handed it into the police. That's what we do. We went down to the police station, we handed it in, and 3 months later, if no one had claimed it, you got it back. So I remember counting down the days to my 3 months, and went to the police station, and nobody had claimed it. So I got my £10 note. I was very young at the time, and £10, that was a lot of money. You could buy a lot of football stickers for £10, believe me, you could. That was some serious cash. However, the thing I was reflecting on the other day was that I remember vividly finding the £10. I remember taking it to the police station. I remember collecting it incredibly vividly. I have absolutely no recollection of what I spent it on. None at all. There's probably something quite profound there in terms of money and our kind of pursuit of it, but then forgetting what we actually used it for. But anyway, we tell this story. So, and the reason we tell it is because, again, it takes us from an abstract thing and turns it into something personal. Somebody in our group said her first experience of money was that she would go to school and they would get free milk. And I was just in the generation you get free milk, and it was always in these 3rd pint bottles, and it was always left out in the sun. So you got it at break time, and it was always kind of like tepidly warm. It was revolting. Anyway, the person in the group was telling a story about how at her school, if you brought in money, you could buy chocolate biscuits when you had your milk. And her memory was her family never gave her the money for the chocolate biscuits when she was at primary school. That's what she remembered. So she remembered, what did she remember about money? She remembered loss. That's what she remembered. That actually it was something that she didn't have and something that denied her an opportunity that others had. And the reason I mention these stories is that I just think, bearing in mind this is a group of strangers who've never been together, this is the opening question. And immediately these stories are starting to reveal some really, really profound and important things about who we are, our life's experience, how we see money, how we've experienced generosity. They're incredibly profound and important. And it's stories that can do that. Stories can tell a story in a way that statistics just can't, that actually words just can't. There's something incredibly profound, I think, about the way that we go and tell stories. So I'm just going to go and share the screen, if I can get the technology to work, because I want to play another story in a bit, but also talk about an idea we've got around Christmas gift and why we're looking to do that. So hopefully you should have a nice pretty picture of a book with lines on. Yes, thank you. There we are. It's, the technology is working. We're doing very well, are we? I should say, by the way, I live in rural Suffolk, which has more than a few issues around dodgy broadband. So hopefully we will have success through the rest of the session. I love this image because to me this is it illustrates what stories are all about. It's the way that you can see words, but they immediately start to create pictures in our mind. They tell us so much more, and they can transport us to a very different place. I was just come back from holiday, and I was reading Sandy Toksvig's book, autobiography. It's 99p on Kindle, so I thought I'll go mad as it's holiday and go and buy. And what I loved about the book is that she's written the whole thing based on the journey on a number 12 bus in southeast London, because she lived in East Dulwich, which I used to live there years and years ago. But each stop, she talks about something around that particular stop and how it connects with her story from her childhood or from the rest of her life. So it's a beautiful concept in terms of how it's done. But it's all about creating pictures in your mind, and it is incredibly powerful way for creating. Anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Christmas gift idea that we're kicking around at the moment, because and give you an example of it, because I think it's an illustration of how we can use stories to kind of connect around generosity, so pulling in this kind of the concept of storytelling and how it has an opportunity, I think, to enable people to really profoundly think about giving and generosity. Because one of the things that we've been vexed about, I think, is about how will Christmas work this year? Where will people be feeling? How will life function? Christmas is not going to be normal, is it? And how will that make people feel? A family member died this year, and the funeral was in the middle of the pandemic, and just strange, just really, really profoundly strange in terms of that whole kind of grieving process. And there are countless people who've gone through something similar. So how will they be feeling about Christmas? How will there be joy there in the same way? Will we be able to connect? Will we be able to see family? If we can see family, what about those we've lost, and how do we feel about that? So I think the consensus is that it will be complex and it will be difficult. Will we be able to do normal Christmas services? Will we be able to do carol services? How will that affect us psychologically and emotionally? So the Church of England this year is doing a slightly different kind of Christmas campaign, and it's called Comfort and Joy. And I've got to be honest, I think that's inspired as a title, because I think that's exactly where people will be. They may well need comfort, and they may well be feeling joyful. They may well be feeling both. They may well be feeling one or the other. It's very difficult to say at this moment what it will be, but Christmas will definitely be funny and a peculiar time. And we were talking about things that would encourage people. And so we're developing this idea of Christmas Gift, which is a podcast for every day of Advent, and we have a virtual Advent calendar. And it's where people talk about when they've received or given generosity. And I think it's the more I've thought about it, the more it really resonates, I think. And it's a powerful illustration, I think, of how stories can transform situations and provide real comfort and inspiration as well. It has relevance to the church, so these are reasons we're really keen on it. It has relevance to church and non-church audiences. If you've listened to Feed Glover's Listening Project, it's a lovely, lovely project on Radio 4. If we've got time, actually, I was going to play one later on. But there's it's beautiful stories of how people's ordinary lives. So it works on a similar kind of thing. But we recognise the human voice is even more important. And so every day it recommends a simple act of generosity. As I say, it's done as an Advent calendar, but the content is applicable all year round. So our hope is that by Advent we'll have 24 stories of generosity. And when we were chatting about it, we were saying, there was someone who said, right, okay, and what we need to do is we need to get loads of famous people, because that'll be really impressive, and then people listen because we'll get famous people. And I was like, I've got real problems with this. If we've got somebody who said that they were, their experience of generosity was that they were abandoned on Richard Branson's island, and that Elton John used his private jet to go and fly them home. I mean, it's a great story, but I'm not sure that it really resonates or echoes with our own experience. To me, the wonder of these stories is about their ordinariness, actually, and that how transformative generosity can be in people's lives, and how wondrously it is never forgotten. And that, to me, is massively, massively important. Years and years ago, I did an MA in applied theology, and I did study down in Devon, and absolutely loved every second of it. It was a radical hotbed at the time. There was just some fantastic lecturers there who really took you outside your comfort zone. But one of the theological concepts they introduced me to, which I adored, was divine compost. And that we are all divine compost was the gist of it. And the reason behind that was that we constantly shape people's lives, for good and for ill. And that in that way, we never really die, because the impact on people's lives will continue, and indeed will be passed on from generation to generation. And I adored my granddad when I was growing up, and admired him hugely, and was thinking about the things that we did together and the lessons of life that he taught me, and how profound that was, and how I'd like to think that I've gone and managed to absorb some of the things that he showed me. And then I'd love to think that some way I'd hand them on to my children. So when I was a child growing up, my granddad played dominoes, loved dominoes, and we would play 5s and 3s. And he was very good, and I was not so great. but tried and loved it, and I loved it, and I can still, you know, it's amazing now. I can still kind of hear the click of the dominoes on the table if I try hard enough. But my granddad was very generous, and I can't tell you how many times I managed to just beat him at 5s and 3s. It was quite remarkable. And now I was one of 4 boys, as I said, and 4 boys born in 5 years. We were all highly competitive, and so I was used to losing. And so being at my granddad's and being able to win at 5s and 3s is wonderful. Anyway, fast forward, and we were on holiday, taking my 2 girls on holiday, and we discovered this cottage that we were in had a table football, and they were so excited. And so we were playing table football, and they loved it, and particularly younger daughter, just as competitive. And anyway, I can't tell you how many times I lost 5-4 playing table football. And I'd like to think that was because what my granddad taught me. He showed me that there's a graciousness actually about allowing other people to win. Not always, but it's a really important thing, and it's a generous thing, and it's a thing that we can do. And that's kind of divine compost in essence, basically. It's just saying that actually people teach us things, we experience things, we learn things from people, and that we then go and hand it on to others, and that's the joy of it all, and that's what life's about. And so I think these acts of generosity, what strikes me about them is that when we look at them, these become stories are not just of a moment, but of a transformed life. And so what I wanted to do now is just go and play one of the giving advisors gave us a wonderful example of what we're on about. And I just thought, here's a short story, it's a couple of minutes long, of somebody who experienced generosity and the impact it had on their lives. So I'll just play that now.
I was about 12 years old, the oldest child of a family of 6. And my dad was unemployed at the time, so we couldn't really afford to do much for our holidays. So this particular year, we'd driven up to the north of England, and we went for a day out along Hadrian's Wall with our picnic. And as we arrived, we met a young American student called Anne Grant, and she was travelling around Britain all on her own. So we said, why don't you join us? And she spent the day with us, sharing our picnic and chatting to all of us. So at the end of the day, we exchanged addresses and went our separate ways. About 2 months later, an enormous parcel arrived at our house, and inside were gifts for absolutely everyone, even my little brothers. And she'd remembered just what everybody liked. She'd remembered that I was really keen on horses, so I had a little pony and some horse books. But she'd also remembered that I was just about to turn 13, and so there was even a little bottle of perfume and a little necklace in a box for me, which I still have to this day. As I say, we were quite poor at the time, and so these gifts were just like treasures from heaven. And they had a huge impact on us all, partly because they were just so unexpected. And over the years, I've often thought about how she came suddenly into our lives and then vanished again, but leaving such a blessing behind. The Bible says that it's important to show hospitality to strangers, and that some people have even entertained angels unawares by doing so. I've sometimes wondered since if Anne was an angel sent by God to bring joy into the hearts of a struggling poor family. But then I think, does it really matter? Because she was certainly an angel to us, earthly or not. And her unexpected generosity made such an impact on all of us. So it just makes me think, could we be somebody's angel today?
I hope that story came through, because isn't it great? It's just such a great story of transformative generosity, and that sense that these, and that's kind of in summary, I think stories resonate. They resonate in a way that nothing else does, but also they resonate because they stand outside of time, and that they will always be remembered, and that they transform and continue to transform. The thing that strikes me in that story you just heard is when she says she still has the perfume bottle. Isn't that just lovely? That actually that one act of generosity is still remembered, is still having its impact, still resonating so many years later. And so I think stories are unbelievably powerful in terms of our ability to talk of generosity, to inspire generosity. And that for us, when we can take any opportunity that we have to enable people to talk, I just think that's an extraordinary thing. To tell us your story, it becomes something that you never forget. Last thing is just as a practical example. I was preaching in a church, and somebody came up to me afterwards, and I was just talking about the different types of generosity. I'd written some reflections on Mary anointing Jesus' feet and how it illustrated different ways to live a generous life. And one of the things that Mary was generous with was her possessions. But that she was creative in terms of how she lived generously. Anyway, this lovely lady, she was talking about that she wanted to give some money to the church, and she worked out, she said, I worked out if I saved up, I got about £150, so I wanted to give that to the church. She said, and then I thought, but I really love Caribbean food. I love cooking Caribbean food. So why don't I use that money to go and buy some ingredients and do a Caribbean food night? And so she did. And she raised £500 and gave it to the church. And I said, do you know, there's a parable about that. I think it's a lovely illustration of how when we can see these don't need to be big and amazing acts of generosity. That's not it. It's about the everydayness of it, actually, which is genuinely remarkable. But there's also something wonderfully edifying and inspiring about enabling people to tell their stories of generosity, because they inspire us in terms of what we can do. But what they really do, they really, really do, is they tell us this is what generous communities create. These are the transformations that we see, and this is what it's all about. But we can't do that if we don't tell stories. So I hope that's been helpful in terms of my kind of and a series of random anecdotes. So now there is a bit, but illustrations of how stories have gone and affected me, and how important that they've got. That I think they are around generosity, and that these are attainable stories. That's my point, really, Tilly. These are attainable stories. These are stories which are happening in every parish, and that there are remarkable stories to be told. It's just finding ways that we can encourage people to tell those stories, but how inspiring that is for everybody else. So, any questions or any thoughts or anything you want to debate or to amplify, I'm very happy to do so. But Mark, is it best to hand back to you at this point, I think?
Jonathan, thank you so much. There was so many good anecdotes in there, and actually just really goes to show when you listen to a story, you really get taken on that journey, don't you? You just find yourself smiling along and just remembering your own feelings around memories of money and all sorts. So I'm a big fan of storytelling, and I've just got a question, Jonathan, for you, and also for Jan and Mark as well. And that is, what kind of stories, if someone's out there thinking, oh, well, what kind of stories could my church tell? What kind of stories do you think churches could be telling to encourage generosity? I'll say Mark. Mark, go on,
Okay.
you kick off there, Mark.
I think it's often people say, oh, we haven't got the big stories, but then the more people talk together, there are stories we tell each other, or stories we've heard that are really important. And I think it's about having those conversations again and really thinking about what we remember. I mean, just what Jonathan was saying was sparking off memories with me about people in my childhood and so on. And I think that will happen in our churches. I think there are people who have been very important in our growing up, in our time and in the community, that we can tell their story, remind people about them. And I think particularly if we're trying to hold on as a local parish church, as we get into bigger and bigger areas, the local is still so important to us, having local people's stories. So yeah, I think it's in those conversations, I think they will come up, I think they will emerge. And I think you'll realise they're far more important than we think, actually, to other people. Yeah.
Jan, anything from your point of view in terms of stories?
Well, I've heard a story from one of the parishes where we've got a rep on our attendees today, where they had no money at the end of their reserves. So they all prayed, you know, we need help, please somebody help us. And within 24 hours, an envelope was posted through the Gift Aid Treasurer's post box with £5,000. They don't know where it came from. They don't know who donated it, but £5,000 was posted in an envelope through their door.
That's extraordinary generosity right there, isn't it?
But Mark is right. We see it across the board with the number of appeals we run within our parishes for the food banks, for homeless projects, for the church box and the Christmas boxes. We see extraordinary acts of generosity and kindness day in, day out. This talk though has taught me that my mother wasn't very generous to me because I was never allowed to win. So, and many about maths in my household, so I created little piles of pounds that all went in the money bags to go into. So I was the little counter.
Yeah.
I think there are so many examples out there. I don't know if people want to share with us. So the people that are attending today, if they want to raise their hand, perhaps we can unmute them and they can share their stories with us.
Yeah, please do. Gareth and I will take a look to see if anyone wants to share any stories of generosity that could inspire us to think about what stories we could be sharing as well collectively.
Yeah, while people are thinking about that, if I tell another story that Jan's mentioning from one of our parishes that really struck me as an early journey of people's generosity. One of our parishes, which is in a much poorer area of our diocese, and people were really struggling. They were raising money for the church, but the vicar was encouraging them to give money away as well. And they were saying, but we're on benefits or we're on limited income. We don't need to give money away. And then they did a carol singing around the village and raised, I think, about £150. And they went to the vicar and said, Vicar, we'd like to give all this money away. And that was such a big step for them. But similar to what sparked the memory, the vicar said, as far as she knows, with no knowledge where it came from or that it was anything related to that, a cheque was, or it may not be a cheque because she'd have known where that had come from, but there was some money put through her door which covered what they'd given away. And, you know, so there's always something there, isn't there? As we take that step, God is taking the steps with us. It's a lovely little story. Yeah.
Oh, hang on. We've got a hand up. 1 second.
It's Philip Leishon. I can allow him to talk.
Aha, go on. Yep. Philip, hello. How are you?
I'm mute. Sorry, you're talking about
you're right. How are you doing? Thank you.
Yeah,
yes. What's your generosity story?
Well, it's the neighbouring parish, really. In the Rhondda, it's been on the national news. We've been affected by severe flooding. And the community in which this church exists, you know, this was a second, I think it might have been even the third time that people have been flooded out from their homes. And when it came to the fact that the church was reopening, you might have thought, well, during lockdown, they've suffered all of this. And so what was coming back into the life of the church would be not a great deal, shall we say. But it actually, the amount of money that came in was tremendous. And a lot of that was to do, I think, with the actions of my colleague. He'll remain nameless because he'd crown me and he wouldn't be King of England if I said who he was. But during the flooding, he was the visible image of the church. You know, he was standing outside people's homes when they were, when they were pushing out the water, and just telling them the church was there. And the story of this got around, and when people are thinking, oh, well, who should we give to? People were saying, well, let's give to the church because Father so-and-so was there. He was there. He couldn't do much other than hold a sweeping brush, but he was there. And I think what I would say about stories, we often hear, don't we, that bad news travels fast, but good news can travel faster, I think. And the power of the story is really important. Your end of the lesson.
I'm going to ask you, can you record that as a sermon, please? Because I've just written some notes down. Good news can travel even faster. I think you're absolutely spot on. I love that. I think there's something about parishes being really part of the community and telling the story of the community, not just about their own story, but telling the story of being part of a community and putting the community first. That is incredibly important as well. Jonathan, just a question then around, we've been doing a lot of work trying to raise the profile of digital giving. And what kind of stories could be told about how that would then encourage people to take another step towards giving digitally?
So I think I think there's amazing opportunities actually around digital giving to go and communicate stories in the kind of first person. So like the audio podcast I just did then, that you've got an ability to communicate a story digitally incredibly powerfully. So I think the challenge of around digital giving, I think, is once you've got the mechanism set up, and it's you still come back to the basic principles of what motivates people to give, and that if we want to motivate people to give, we need to be showing the impact of what giving is doing within our parish and the change is enabling to happen, and also the kind of, I don't know, the values is a bit trite, but the essence of what a church's ministry is actually, but personalized. So it's like this is a personal story of personal transformation. I was going to mention, if I can go off a slightly random tangent, but a church I used to go to, there was a knitting group, and every week they would have created prayer shawls, which were to give to people who were sick or unwell in the community, and they managed to. So, and every week they would. The shawls would be put on the altar and they would be blessed, and then they would. And I was just thinking, well, that's interesting. But anyway, it's all part of the church's ministry. But then the vicar asked, we had a friend who was seriously ill, and would they like to go and have a prayer shawl? And I just thought it was the most extraordinary. It suddenly became something personal, something real. So when I thought of the church, what did I think of? I thought of that, actually, that act of generosity and kindness. So it's that they embodied, this act embodied actually the very thing which we want the church to be. It was God's love in action. But the power of when digital giving works is when you can harness the ease of giving with the stories which go and illustrate it. But it's digital giving, so you've got a kind of, you have the power to go and be able to go and communicate that in so many different ways, and that makes for incredibly powerful stories. But they don't need to be overproduced, and that's the other thing I would say, is that actually we've talked about generosity being humble, ordinary generosity is really, really good. But similarly, in terms of telling the story, these don't have to be polished. These don't have to be, overproduced. Actually, they work less well if they are. That actually they should be just ordinary stories, people talking in a very ordinary way. And I just think they have an amazing resonance and power behind them.
I think that's such a good point about having stories that don't feel so polished and corporate, because I think on social media, we see a lot of traction on social media, as a lot of churches have, and those in the moment, Facebook Live, that doesn't necessarily look completely polished, but there's something very personal about it. And if you're telling a story, then I think social media as part of your strategy. It really needs to be something that you do. So, you know, of the attendees who are here today and those who are watching later on, if there's one thing you do following on from this webinar, it's find a story of generosity and share it to your social media followers and your church community. I think you'll be surprised at how many of the stories will come from that, and then match that up with the ease of giving, as Jonathan says. So a link then, if someone is inspired to or feels called to then respond with a gift, then make it easy for them to do so. What I've been blown away by during lockdown is how generous people have been and how they want to be generous. I feel it's quite a privilege to see some of the stories that we get coming in of people who have been giving and signing up to Gift Direct, for example, because they want to help their church more and they want to see it continue. Okay, Gareth, any further questions have come through, or the attendees, anything you want to ask before we close today?
No questions in the Q&A so far.
No questions. Anyone else got a generous story they'd like to share or a question? You're all very well disciplined, because we do try and keep these to 45 minutes, and you're all very, very good at doing that. So if there aren't any final questions, then we'll end today. But please do take that one thing away with you, which will be find a generous story to share and make it easy for people to share. Jonathan, I can't thank you enough for today. I'm going to go back and listen to that once we've stopped recording it, and we'll be sharing it with the people who couldn't make it today and with clergy and treasurers who were unable to attend. We know lots of people watch it afterwards when we look at the figures. Jonathan, thank you so much for today. I feel really inspired now to find a story to share. I'll be bothering Mark and Jan about that later on. Again, thank you so much, Jonathan.
Pleasure.
Very, very kind.
Lovely to be with you all.
Thank you. And just to remind you that our final Generosity Matters in season 1, yes, we're going for a season 2. We'll be going on Netflix. All right, maybe not Netflix. We'll go on YouTube instead, yeah. We'll be doing a season 2 coming up shortly as well. But the last one of this season will be on the 1st of October, same time, 12:30, with Bishop June and Bishop Andy talking about the future of giving in the Church of Wales, and a particular focus on the Diocese of Llandaff. And at that point, we will also share with you our new checklist of giving and generosity. So if you've gone through all these webinars, we are now going to come up with a checklist of all the things that you could be doing and your church could be doing to improve generosity and giving and encouraging that generous spirit. So that will be available for you all. So for now, Jan, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mark, as always, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting on a Zoom suit as well, Mark. And Jonathan, thanks again. Absolutely wonderful. And Philip Lation for sharing your story. Much appreciated. We'll close now. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.